Hey guys, welcome to, can't even remember which episode this is. I think it's like almost the 19th. Let me know, as always, if you guys can hear me okay in the audience. Um, uh, but also, if anybody knows, when I went to click to go live, it said something, a message came up saying something about not having enough storage. Um, I hope that it will still record the episode live. Let me know if you guys have any information about how that works. I don't know if any of you guys have StreamYard as well or anything like that. But hopefully, the message didn't mean that it wouldn't save the episode on the channel. Maybe it's just about having the capacity to download it in some other way. But today we're going to be talking with Michael. He's a philosophy teacher and history teacher. He reached out wanting to talk about naturalism, and so I'm going to bring him on and see how this goes. Hey, Michael. Thanks again for coming on.
No worries. Appreciate you having me on.
So give us a little bit about your background and what your interests are, and then we can get started.
Absolutely. So I'll tell you a little bit about my academic background. And of course, I'm more than happy to elaborate on anything that I say here. So my academic background, I have a BA in philosophy. It was kind of the general history of philosophy. The program I was in, we took courses from each different time period. From there, I kind of shifted gears a little bit and actually went on to study historical theology. At one point in time, I was considering going into the ministry. That changed. But I studied historical theology. It was a master's, but it was kind of a broad-based introduction. I had to take classes in on like the Hebrew Bible, the Christian. This was a seminary, Christian seminary. But most of what I focused on was the history of Christianity, specifically the impact and influence of early modern science on Christianity. I focused on a English theologian named Samuel Clarke and how he interpreted Newton's Principia and how it changed the early modern conception of God. Like all of a sudden we have this new idea and understanding of the universe, and I was kind of very interested in tracing how that influenced how people thought of God in the early modern period. From there, I went on to get another master's, and if you want to talk about bad decisions, I'm more than happy to talk about that as well. But
Sure.
I got a master's in history proper. And I focused this time. I've always been interested in what's called the history of science. I focused on the reception of Darwinian thought in 19th century America, specifically in the American South. So how scientists and theologians received and interpreted Darwin. Most recently, I've been working on my PhD in philosophy. So I went from philosophy to history, back to philosophy. Where I'm interested in the very broad category would be the philosophy of science. The more specific, once you start going up in your master's to PhD level, you get more and more refined in what you're doing until you're focusing on this little tiny bit of history. Right now, I'm focusing on, broadly speaking, the philosophy of science, more specifically, the philosophy of time. I'm looking at an early 20th century French philosopher named Gaston Bachelard, who was one of the first in France in the early 20th century to be receptive of Einstein's theory of relativity, and was one of the first to kind of discuss the philosophical influences of Einstein's relativity. But Bachelard also wrote broadly about epistemology, generally speaking, and epistemology's relationship to science proper.
So that's really interesting. Yeah, philosophy of science has definitely been one of my interests as well. Although, at least from the little bit that I've read so far, I feel like a lot of philosophers that I've tried to talk about science, I think, have made certain errors in their approach. And I'm curious to see whether or not you agree, and what errors do you think they found, or what errors do you think they've made in their approach? Because that's been my experience so far.
Mm-hmm. I'm very much so inclined to agree, but I'm curious to know what errors you think they've made. Given
Well,
my, yeah, go ahead.
well, I think part of, I think some of the perspective has been that uh, they think that the way in which scientific theories develop are far more uh, uh, affected by culture rather than kind of an expansion of where the data seems to point to. Like, not to say that there isn't some biases and there is bad science that takes place, but um, I don't think that is an issue for the majority of the way the science is done. And I think um, even aspects of the what is probably one of the most famous uh, philosophy of science works, uh, the scientific revolutions.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of that work, I think, exaggerates certain aspects of the way the science is done. I think that, for example, we had talked about this a little bit before you came on, but this idea of science, for it to function, we have to take um, uh, certain assumptions that are in some way themselves not scientific. So the idea, for example, that verificationism is self-defeating, which I agree to a point, but it's usually used incorrectly by people that are trying to support religious ideas, as opposed to making fair criticisms of the limitations of science. Like, I agree that science doesn't give us certainty, because I don't think such a thing is really possible, other than, I'm certain that I exist, whatever that form that takes. But I think science gets us the closest to understanding the way things actually are, or at least given the tools available to us to use. And so I'm curious to see, with your interest in science, like, where you think that philosophy gets it right in its discussion about science, and where you think it gets it wrong.
Yeah, so I think we might be pretty close here. I'll tell you kind of where I'm coming from, and feel free to jump in at any time.
Sure.
My approach to the philosophy of science, and this, of course, is largely a result of my background in history. Um, I'm very much so in the what I would call the Kuhnian camp. Thomas Kuhn, probably one of the most, if not the most famous philosopher of science of the 20th
Right.
century, wrote The Nature and Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Kuhn's approach to exploring the philosophy of science. So I'll compare and contrast Kuhn and Popper real quick. I see somebody in the chat brought up falsification. And I'll use this to hopefully explain my point a little bit more. But so you Karl Popper, his idea of falsification, probably, again, if you're having a contest who's the most famous philosopher of science, you're probably going to get either Karl Popper or Thomas Kuhn, two of the biggies. Karl Popper has this idea that he's looking at the problem in the philosophy of science called the problem of demarcation. How do you separate quote unquote real science from pseudoscience? Popper was interested in, for example, what distinguished Einsteinian relativity from, for example, a Marxian view of history. Or he's right in the early 20th century, so Marxism was huge, and so was psychoanalytic psychology.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically Freud, Jung, those early guys. And so Popper kind of compares and contrasts Einstein with Freud, and says that the big thing that Einstein's theory of relativity had going for it is that Einstein made claims about the natural world that would ultimately be proven either right or wrong. And of course, we all know that Einstein was proven correct by Arthur Eddington and his observation of light bending in the solar eclipse, right? Really awesome story there. But Popper says that like this is the hallmark feature of science, is that it can be proven demonstrably false or true, right? Kuhn's approach is more historical, and so Kuhn was interested in looking at how scientists actually do science, approaching it from a historical perspective, looking at he writes a book on the Copernican revolution, and Kuhn's whole point was that, and this is where I think philosophers sometimes go wrong, and again, my personal bias might be showing here, but I think they go wrong when they don't consider the data available to us, that data being the historical data, right? Because Kuhn's big criticism of Popper was that Popper's theory might be sound logically, but that's not how science actually works. That if you look at actual science, if you look at the people doing science, if you look at the historical record, people don't set out to falsify theories every time they go to the science laboratory, right? So where I think philosophers can go wrong is, one, if they're doing philosophy in a vacuum.
Sure.
If they're not taking into account either the historical record, or even, this sounds really weird, but some philosophers of science aren't like up to date on like actual science.
Sure. Yeah.
And so philosophy, when done by itself and not put into conversations with other disciplines, I think can lead some people astray, so to speak.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, as someone that supports science, I even have some anxiety about talking about science as proving things true.
Mhm.
I'm even skeptical of going that far. I would say that because, like I said before, I don't think that science necessarily can give us certainty, can give us, I think the best explanations and the more probable explanations for the way things are. But I don't think we can really. But I don't think it, for the most part, it's claiming to provide us with certainty.
Mhm.
What it's doing is saying, here's the data available, here are the tools that we have. Let's try to, in the most rigorous way, understand the way the things at least appear to be, and then move from there. So I don't think it's a flaw of science that it can't provide us with certainty. I think, if anything, that is, to me, it's a strength that it has above religion. That it's religions that claim to have certainty that then they can't justify.
Mhm.
But yeah, I guess my question would be where, because you mentioned the kind of the historical, um, taking more of a historical approach to understanding the way science is done. Where do you think that um, philosophers may be confused on that issue?
Yeah. Well, I think we're speaking very broadly here, and I could say one of the confusions that I often hear, mostly from students, not necessarily like philosophers, but to return to this idea that you were talking about, whether or not science gives us certainty. There's kind of a naive assumption, and naive, I'm not saying in like in a
Sure.
critical or negative way, it's just a unexamined assumption that science is kind of leading us closer to truth. And when applied to the history of science, that same sort of naive view views the history of science as the uh, accumulation of knowledge, right? That we started off not knowing anything about the universe. and that we're slowly building up and building up, and that this idea that one day science will come to an end because we'll discover everything, we'll know everything there is to know about the universe. I would agree with you in that sense that as an unexamined assumption, like I don't think that's, and this is a point that Kuhn makes, that's not really what the history of science shows us. That it's kind of, you're mistaken to look at it as the accumulation of knowledge. What Kuhn points out is a little more subtle point, and he got criticized a lot for saying that different scientific theories are incommensurable with each other, because a lot of people said that this leads to some sort of like epistemological relativism where there's no such thing as truth, and we can never know right for wrong. That's not where Kuhn was going. The idea that Kuhn was pointing towards is not that we know more and more about the world, but that we're getting better and better about finding things out about the world. So it's a refinement of method rather than an accumulation of knowledge.
But how? So that's a little confusing to me, because wouldn't a refinement of method imply that we're understanding the way things are a little more? Again, not with certainty, but understanding the appearance of the way things are. Because I think I want to make this distinction that, I don't think that we have full access to ontology, meaning the nature of existence and being. Or even if we did, we wouldn't know that we did. So that's what I mean when I say that we don't have certainty. But I don't agree with Kuhn in the sense that I still think there's a progression, that there is an evolution through science, that I think we are accumulating a greater understanding, not just refinement. So
let me I'll build off of that a little bit. And to be fair, I think there are some definite issues with Kuhn, and he has a really hard time answering this question. But what I mean by that, to return to a point that you made earlier, when you said that science doesn't deal with certainty, right? So in this, I can kind of maybe circle this back around to naturalism and my views about naturalism. I think I would depart a little bit from how I framed Kuhn's argument, and say that it's a certain type of knowledge. So science is inherently inductive, right? Although, mathematics is deductive and science is maybe built off of mathematics. We could come back to that relationship later if you like. But all scientific claims are inductive claims about the universe. And all inductive claims have a possibility of being wrong or incorrect, right? And so what I think, you use the word evolution, which might be a better way of approaching the history of science. I do think that what the history of science has showed us is that the probability of some things existing ontologically are lower or higher as a result of the movement of science.
right.
And this is where my naturalism would come into play. I think historically, looking at the history of science, what you have seen is a decrease of supernatural explanations about physical causes in the world, and an increase of naturalistic explanations about physical causes in the world. That doesn't give us a knockdown, drag out argument against supernaturalism, but it does show us that the probability that the supernatural impacts the physical world is steadily decreasing.
Right. Well, yeah, I can agree with that for sure. What would you say to, like I mentioned earlier, to those that say the science is based on certain axioms that are themselves not verifiable by science? So the idea that like something like logic and reason and even like I said earlier, some people think that verification is in some sense self-defeating, because we can't scientifically verify that verification is the only form of the only approach that will lead us to knowledge. This is what critics say about these things.
Yeah. And this is, to recognize this is a good objection. So I get this a lot when I have conversations with, especially when I have conversations with theists. I've heard a couple of different arguments here. There's kind of the, and I forget what they call this. I think it's a type of, there's an argument that I've heard by theists that on the one hand argues that science presupposes certain theistic elements about the world, right? And then on the other hand, I've heard this argument employed to say that naturalism itself can't be verified by science,
right?
And so that as a result, I'm accepting some sort of unscientific explanation about the world. People approach this in different ways. Most famously, the logical positivist principle of verificationism in the mid 20th century, the idea that only empirically verifiable statements are true. Historically, that had a lot of problems. That kind of morphed into a kind of a strong form of empiricism. My personal response to that would be that I'll start off with what I think is a somewhat controversial claim. I don't really think that science is beholden to philosophical categories. I'll start off by saying that.
Can you elaborate on what you mean?
Sure. Let me say that, and I'll come back to it because I want to make a general point, but I'll be more than happy to explain that. I don't think science is beholden to philosophical categories. So any sort of I might get myself into trouble, or I'll just say it. We'll make for good conversation regardless. Even certain logical categories, I don't think are necessarily. I don't think you can box science into it. But the second part of that would be that I think that the flip side is that I think that strong philosophical positions can be derived from the implication of science.
Okay.
So, in other words, a lot of philosophers have this idea that you have philosophy and then you have science. I want to kind of flip that around. This is kind of an approach if you've not A.J. Ayer, who am I thinking of? Quine. This is an approach that was popularized by Quine.
I want to talk about him later at that point, but keep going.
Yeah, he has a great essay called Epistemology Naturalized. But I would say that my response to, well, you can't verify naturalism, so how can you justify being a naturalist? I would say, again, it's not that I can give you a logical argument that demonstrates the validity of naturalism, but what I can do is point to the history of science and say that naturalistic explanations have been the most successful types of explanations. And that if we're coming at this in terms of probability, what's most likely right, most likely correct, or what's the best way of investigating these things, the naturalistic explanation presupposed by science, I think would be our best avenue.
Right.
And not just by science. I think other disciplines presuppose naturalism too. But again, I'll save that.
My approach to responding to those kind of theistic objections is that, well, first of all, I think that things like reason and logic are more descriptive than they are prescriptive, although I think they can alternate. I think experience is primary. And then all these other things are languages and tools that we use and certain mental mechanisms that we use to try to make sense of our reality. And so it's not that I'm presupposing anything. It's that I'm observing a certain kind of phenomenology of my experience. But the second thing is, I would say that even if we were to accept the claim that science has to take certain axioms to function, that doesn't justify any kind of religious assumptions. Because what the move they'll make is to say, well, you're taking logic on faith, so why can't I take God on faith? It's like, that's a dishonest move to make, because I can't help but follow certain logical axioms. It is impossible, and it would be completely incoherent and contradictory to deny those axioms. I can, however, deny the assumption that a God exists. Like, there's no problem in the two are not synonymous. And I think that is, it's always kind of, it's frustrating because and this move is used especially by Muslims in my experience, but I've also have seen expressed by Christians as well, where they think they have this kind of got you moment where it's like, oh, don't you see that religion and science are really like on the same level of doing things? Like, no, yeah, it may be true that we have to rely on logic, and maybe, because I'm not even certain that that's the case, but that is true for any kind of argument that one is trying to make. There's no need or necessity for me to believe in anything supernatural, just because I can't be certain that the tools that we do have can give us kind of some kind of absolute knowledge.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I'll ask you a couple of questions just because I'm curious.
Sure.
Yeah. So I've listened to a few of y'all's videos and heard y'all's general approach to conversations about religion. But where would you fall on the naturalism scale? Would you accept that label? Would you say that you're more of an empiricist, or how would you approach that?
I would say that I'm probably more of a methodological naturalist.
Okay.
Because I think the term in general applies to me pretty consistently. As a matter of principle, I'm not really willing to really make any kind of claims about ontology. I'm pretty much a hard skeptic when it comes to this idea that we can have some kind of concrete access to the way that things really are. I don't think it's possible. And even the thing is, even on an epistemic level, even if we had it, we wouldn't know that we had it, because there's always that chance. Well, what if my senses are flawed, or what if it's the Matrix or Descartes' demon? Like, there are certain skeptics' problem that we just can't get out of. Brain in a vat, that's one, for example. But I don't think that is an issue. I don't think that's a problem, because for me it's like, well, okay, well then what can we say? Is there any kind of purpose to philosophy and science? Well, if we can't get to certainty, let's get to the next best thing, which is justified belief, as close to the way it appears to be, and let's remove as many of our assumptions as we can and try to get to what at least appears to be the most reasonable conclusions. And so then how do we do that? Well, I think science is the way to do that when it's done properly. I think science and philosophy have to work together and have to be kind of merged together. And I think sometimes certain observations may lead to certain tensions there, especially when it comes to quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
And I've had a conversation with my brother about this, or even what we mean by like mathematical objects or mathematical language. Like, how does it actually translate into in what is real? I think science, to some degree, has work to do in translating some of these concepts into something concrete in a way that we can actually understand on a human level. Like, what does it mean for, because I look at math like a language.
Yeah.
And not everybody does.
Yeah.
And some mathematicians think that math, is a kind of object. In a
Right.
sense. I don't understand that, and just even on an intuitive level, it doesn't register.
Hmm.
So I hope that
Yeah.
clears up some of that.
No, it does. And to kind of circle back to this idea that you brought up, that science has to take certain axioms as true, or assume certain things as true in order to function. I see this a lot when it comes to mathematics. There's a couple of things I wanted to address here, and hopefully I won't forget all of them. Um, some ideas that I hear floating around, especially on YouTube, that I've encountered quite frequently, and in discussions with theists that I've encountered quite frequently. So one is this idea that science is predicated on certain Christian assumptions about the world, and that somehow Christianity is responsible for the rise of modern science.
Yeah, it's delusional.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. And the other thing I want to talk about is what you just mentioned with, especially with mathematics. I think part of this issue lies with a difference in that philosophy can help us with different definitions of what objective means. And a lot of people are operating on some sort of Platonic notion of objectivity, which, as a naturalist, I would reject out of hand. But to return to the first one, if you don't mind, if I break
Yeah,
these
go ahead.
down a little bit, because I've heard this so much. Um, the idea that modern science, as it comes about in the 16th century, right? Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, and culminating in Newton, that this could only happen because of certain cultural ideas that were brought about by Christian Europe. Um, Historically is false. Like, there's a historian of science, Ronald Numbers. I'd highly suggest any of his writing. He writes a lot about like the history of creationism. He has a book called The History of Creationism. He has another book called Galileo Goes to Jail, which is about certain myths in the history of science. And this is one of the myths that he addresses. But historically, this is true. And empirically, it's false, because what we would consider science, especially things such as medicine and astronomy, arose in other cultures which did not have Christianity.
Right.
Right. So that's where I would start with that objection. Places like ancient China, of course, developed some very sophisticated modern medical techniques. Ancient India developed a lot of precursor to modern psychological techniques. The Mayans, as you know, had a very sophisticated astronomy. Well, it was astrology, but very sophisticated mathematical system that allowed them to predict solar phenomenon. So that's it's a very narrow view of history. But this general idea that science has to make certain axiomatic assumptions, I just don't see. Um, I don't see that historically. Some scientists did make certain assumptions. I won't deny that, right? The most famous example being somebody like Isaac Newton assumed that God behaved in certain ways, and most famously built his Principia off the assumption that space was kind of the sensorium of God, right? Newton was a very weird guy.
Sure.
So, yeah, certain scientists, yes, but modern science doesn't have to make those assumptions. And the pushback that I get a lot of times is, well, what about logic? What about mathematics? Right? Science assumes math. You can't have science without math. Math assumes that there's a lot of ontological assumptions about mathematics. And I said that those assumptions are almost always Platonic. And that's the idea that numbers exist. Like, you have the universe, that numbers exist like somewhere out here.
Yeah,
Or
which to me is completely incoherent. Or not incoherent, but I don't. It doesn't make sense. Like I don't agree that that's correct.
Right. And what you said, I think, is a good response to that. If you treat mathematics as a language, language doesn't have an ontology, but of course, we still use it and it still works, right? So, pragmatically, we can use language to accomplish a whole host of things, including having this conversation on the internet right now, the creation of all these wonderful technological things or a product of language. It's the same with mathematics. And so when I talk about like math being objective from a naturalistic perspective, I don't mean that it's objective in a Platonic sense, because
Right.
as a naturalist, I deny that. Well, I affirm that the universe is everything that is the case. To channel Wittgenstein, right? That the natural world is all that there is, and so mathematics would have to be a part of that somehow.
I guess just real quick for the audience, if you could define Platonism, just in case
Sure.
for the clarification.
Yeah. So going all the way back to the very beginning of philosophy, you have ancient Greek philosophy, the big three Greeks: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Plato had this foundational idea that we're still wrestling with today, that you have the physical world as it's manifested to us, and the realm of what he called the forms.
Mm-hmm.
And so the example that Plato gives in one of his dialogues is, if you take concepts like love, for example, or beauty or truth, right? I look at my wife and I say, wow, my wife is beautiful. And then I look up at the moon and I say, wow, the moon is beautiful, right? One's a human being that I have a biological attraction to, the other's a giant floating rock in the sky, right? How can they both be beautiful? Well, Plato says, because we have this idea of beauty. And once you get deeper into Plato, this idea of beauty is kind of imprinted on our souls, because our souls have been reborn over and over again. So our souls have caught this glimpse of the forms. And when we are born into this world, we still have this idea of what beauty is. So we're able to categorize things as beautiful because we have knowledge of the forms. That probably sounded very crazy.
No, I mean, obviously, I know what you're talking about, but
Yeah. Yeah. Google Plato Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It'll give you a great description of it. But this idea of Platonism, this idea that our world makes sense because it's predicated on some otherworldly supernatural world, was also kind of assumed into Jewish, Christian, and Muslim philosophy throughout the Middle Ages. And Platonism, in one form or another, kind of became the norm for especially for Christian philosophy.
right,
Yeah.
right, yeah. So you mentioned at one point, and I was actually going to bring this up. You mentioned Quine,
Hmm.
and I wanted to ask you what you thought of, because growing up, um, I watch a lot of conversations and debates, uh, sometimes heated, sometimes not, between my father, who was a philosophy professor, and my
Hmm.
brother, who was a physicist.
Hmm.
And my father actually knew Quine,
Oh wow.
and uh, you know, he was using the concept of the underdetermination of theories, as a kind of, and I think, like we were saying before, I think it's one of those things where I can even agree with some of the, um, so I mean, I'm trying to think of where to start here. The, um, correct me if I'm remembering wrong, but the underdetermination of theories, I think, is this idea that sometimes you're left in a position where you have two theories that explain all the same phenomena, but they are uh, inconsistent with one another. Like, they're different theories, and yet they explain all the same things. And so, in that kind of situation, we have no way of ever choosing one or another. Are you familiar with this?
um Quine's, is this an idea from Quine, or are you
I,
talking about
I think,
indeterminacy?
yeah. So I think Quine had something, talked about it, if I'm not mistaken. I may be getting confused, but I think it was Quine. Um, I,
I
I'll
gotta
double
be,
check. I'll double
yeah,
check.
yeah. Please do. But while you're double checking, to be 100% honest with you, it's been a solid 5 years since I've read any Quine. It's not my forte and background. Kuhn has an idea that's very similar to that, which is the idea of incommensurability. That he has this idea of the Gestalt shift, the duck rabbit shift, right? The physicist who was on the like cutting edge of Einstein early 20th century was looking at Newton, looking at Einstein, and he could kind of accept one or the other, but he couldn't like really reconcile the two. Is that kind of what you're thinking?
Yeah, so it was Quine. I was right.
Okay.
It's basically the idea that for any theory, there's always at least one rival theory that is also supported by the evidence given. And so we're kind of stuck in this kind of underdeterminacy, where for any subject matter, there are incompatible theories, all of which fit the data equally well. And I'm not, I my understanding, again, being limited in understanding of science, I think that may be true kind of in the early stages of science. But I don't think that is historically accurate. Like I think there's, the reasons why certain theories emerge as preferred is because there is, at some point, there is something that it's able to explain better than its competing theories. So I don't agree that there is a state of underdeterminacy, at least to the degree that Quine was arguing it for.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with Quine. It's been a while since I've really dug into Quine. I would need to see a couple of concrete examples, kind of what he means by that. My first inclination, my first response, Bachelard has this idea in his, I should know this. I don't remember which book it is, The Scientific Mind. And in another book that he wrote called The Philosophy of No. And Bachelard's idea is that it's similar to Popper's falsification, slightly different, but Bachelard looks at the history of science and says that what you see when you actually examine and kind of get your feet dirty and look at all the different attempts that have been made throughout the course of the history of science, is really, when you look at the history of science, is the history of failure. Right. We tell a different story to make sense of all the stuff that's happened over the past, 600 years. There's a historian named Jonathan Knoll. I don't know about his first name. His last name's Knoll, Null, who wrote a book about late 20th century Darwinism. And what he writes, the entire book is about all of these scientists who were following in the footsteps of Darwin, who were trying to figure out what exactly evolution meant. This was prior to genetics, right? So this is prior to the neo-Darwinian synthesis of the mid 20th century. But they kind of accepted Darwin's theory of natural selection, but then Darwin also had this theory of sexual selection. But then you had all these other scientists who were saying, well, what about Lamarck? What about like phenotypical evolution? What about all these other things? And what Knoll shows is that, eventually you have this kind of like weaning out process where a lot of these people were unable to verify the claims that they were making and kind of eventually just kind of fell out of favor slowly.
Right.
So what I would say to the kind of Quinean objection of the what was it, underdetermination, that some theories do appear to explain phenomenon better than others. And yes, you might have competition between theories at first, like in what Kuhn would call the pre-paradigmatic phase of science. Right. So you look at the history of electricity in the 17th and 18th century, there was no determinate theory about what electricity was. And so all these people created all these crazy ideas. Like at that level, maybe it was impossible to choose between one or the other because they both were explaining things so well. But you can't apply that to something like relativity and quantum mechanics nowadays. What's the competition? Like,
Right.
there's
Right.
none.
What are some strengths that you would say that naturalism as a position has over other perspectives?
Yeah, so I'll start with the opposite of naturalism, which is supernaturalism. Um, the strength that naturalism has over supernaturalism is its explanatory power. Its ability to explain and understand the world. But another strength of naturalism, and this is an issue that I encounter a lot with people who hold like conspiratorial views, especially. One of the things that I think makes naturalism work so well is that its evidence is commonly accessible.
Right.
Right. So I can say, well, the planets move in a oval formation around the sun. How can I demonstrate that? I can show you my mathematical formula that I've used to calculate their motion. You can see if that mathematical formula actually matches up with the movements themselves. This is something that we both can appeal to and that we both can find a solid answer to. Supernaturalism almost always boils down to a personal experience.
Um, two quick things. One is I just want to, because this was going to be my answer as well. Future predictions would be my answer. I think is for me the key difference is that science can make novel predictions. I mean, we can all come up with a narrative or a story that can try to explain what we see, but I think it's in the predictions and those predictions coming true that I think the real strength of science lies. I agree with what you said as well, that I think people on the theistic side incorrectly, will say things like, well, when you're doing an experiment or you're observing a result, you're still having an experience. But that is an experience that we can all have access to simultaneously. That we have a way to kind of separate that experience from something purely imaginary. Like if I have a certain feeling that God is talking to me, well, how do I know that God is actually talking to me as opposed to that I'm not hallucinating? I think to be honest, I think even with any experience, there is some skepticism, or there is some potential for error there, but far less with something that is consistently observed and shared um, in a way that's more external than the kind of experiences that religious people want to refer to. I think there's a distinction there. I remember talking with somebody on Discord once who literally made the claim that he believed in some kind of Egyptian religion and some kind of Egyptian god.
Okay.
And he believed that it was very strange. That his experience with this deity was on equal grounds as somebody eating breakfast. It's like, well, you're both having an experience, not recognizing that really those kind of claims are inherently different kinds of claims with different kinds of verifications. That they're not on equal grounds. They're not only, it's a different thing. And yes, I may not be there to like verify that so and so ate breakfast today, but that is at least something that we have all had an experience of. That is far less likely to be some kind of product of delusion than hearing voices that only said individual hears. It's this very strange thing that people don't seem to recognize the difference of the kind of claims that we're talking about there.
Yeah, and I can somewhat understand it. Religious experiences are oftentimes profound, personal, life-altering things that individuals experience. But Hume's problem of miracles is usually the first thing I go to. I can't. Your personal experience about something does nothing to convince me of that thing's truth or validity.
Sure.
Just
Right.
doesn't. It might make it more true for you, right? But in terms of philosophical argumentation, scientific argumentation, historical argumentation, it does nothing to make me believe that this idea is somehow like credible or more credible.
Question from the chat. What is the difference between the real and the imaginary, and the physical and the non-physical, or natural and supernatural?
Yeah. It's a good question, first of all.
I can start if you want me to.
Yeah, sure. Be my guest.
So, in terms of the physical and the non-physical, I think this is the problem that I run into, is that I can't even conceive of what is meant by something not being physical. Like when I think about what is real, I think of whatever it having a temporal and spatial dimension as being features of what makes something real. And so I don't know what is meant by non-physical in the context, because I think it's kind of almost a word like perfection. I'm not convinced it actually refers to anything with actual content. And as far as real and imaginary, the difference between a pure idea of something and an actual object in the world. Now, I think ideas are constructed from experiences, but it's on the idea itself may exist as a process. Like, when you think of an idea, your brain is doing something, right? So I think the idea has a physical dimension in that sense, where it's just kind of your brain doing something that it does. But I don't, the idea of an apple isn't an apple. And now I would still say, and some people look at me sideways when I say this, but I would still say that an idea of an apple is still a physical phenomenon, but it's of a different kind. It's a different type of thing that's taking place.
Yeah.
Another question that was a follow-up question was, what is the difference between a real novel testable prediction and an unreal novel testable predication or prediction?
Yeah. I'll kind of build off of what you said for that first distinction. So what's the difference between real and imagined? So I think psychology would provide a good case study here, especially if you look at something like mental illness, right? What makes the schizophrenic's delusions a delusion versus reality? What's real, and of course, to start off like any good philosopher would, it depends on what you mean by real, right?
Sure.
I would assume that what's meant by real here is, to me, how I interpret that. What is real is what can be verified, right? Independently verified, as somebody put in the chat, collectively verified. You and I can get together and agree that X is the case, right? What is imaginary is real in the sense that you're imagining it, right? The schizophrenic's delusions are real to the schizophrenic. They're just not real to me or to you or to anybody else who is involved in that person's life. It's the same with like depressive thinking, right? The depressed person creates an imaginary narrative in their head that their life is, not to get too real with any of this, but I've been to a lot of therapy. So the depressed person creates an imaginary narrative in their head that maybe that they imagine that their life's not worth living, or that no one likes them, or that people are avoiding them. And, a good therapist will say, well, that's not true. What about this person? What about that person? Right? It's verifiable to other people, right? Other people can come to you and say, well, in fact, no, that's not the case, right?
Yeah, right. And I think people get it confused. Like, yes, of course, people's feelings, even hallucinations, are real in the sense that you're having a real experience.
Right.
The the issue is, well, what is that experience corresponding to?
Mhm.
Because obviously, the idea here is that we all share the same reality. So
Yeah.
if somebody is having an experience that there is another person in the room, but none of us can see it except for that one person, they may be having a real experience in terms of like what they're sensing,
Yes.
but that person might not actually be there in a kind of in a shared experience and in a universal reality. Um, and so I think it can get a little bit muddied at times, even using the word real. But I still think it's useful in the
Mhm.
way that we kind of navigate life.
Right. And likewise, we know that the brain is capable of producing not real things, right?
Yeah, I find dreams, for example, the science of dreams
Yes.
to be very fascinating. Like,
Mhm.
there's actually not much of a difference in terms of what our brain is doing and what we experience in a dream, sense-wise, than when we experience what we call the real world when we wake up and go about our day. So in that sense, it is our brains that are kind of creating what our experiences are, but there's still a difference in what we can verify there.
Mhm. Right.
Uh,
Right. What was the follow-up question to that?
um, I don't recall, but I do want to point to this comment, which I find interesting. It's meaningless to say that the real corresponds to reality. Nothing corresponds to itself. Correspondence is a relation, and relations imply diverse relata, even self-identity. I'm not sure what to make of that. Um,
Uh, I mean, I would just say that that's the definition of reality. That might not be a very satisfying answer. Nothing corresponds to itself. Correspondence is a relation.
but I think the relation there would be between our epistemology and what we are thinking is the case with what actually is the case. I think that is where there is uh, by real. I think we're referring to a judgment about our reality that we make through the tools that we use.
Mhm.
And so, what is real is when that judgment actually is correct.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the problem is there. Um, I
Yeah.
don't think I'm a little confused.
If they can unpack that a little bit more, that would be
Yeah.
fantastic.
Um, so yeah, I would just say what is real is um, just what is the case.
Mhm.
I don't know that that's a problem philosophically. Um,
I don't think so, but I'm open to
yeah,
suggestions.
yeah. I mean, I think when we talk about correspondence, I think we're just talking about whether or not our ideas and epistemology and predictions and observations are actually, uh, what's a better word, are matching up with what is actually out there.
Mhm.
Um, a question for you. Alec asks, are people still talking about Lakatos in physical science?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so I'll provide a little bit of context there, and then I'll speak to your point a little bit more. So I raised the problem of demarcation before, which is the problem of how do we distinguish quote unquote real science from fake science, right? What makes you know anti-vaccine propaganda not science but propaganda, right? How do we distinguish that from actual like medical research? That's the question of demarcation. um Historically, there have been a number of answers to this. One of which, well, two of which we've already discussed. Karl Popper's falsification principle, that real science is falsifiable, that scientific claims are falsifiable. The second one is from Kuhn, which is that he says that science is paradigmatic, that what would separate real science from fake science is that real science undergoes historical, oftentimes radical changes in their theoretical assumptions about the world. Lakatos was responding to Kuhn's objection to Popper. Kuhn's objection being Popper falsification is great, but that's not really quite how actual science works. So Lakatos kind of took that objection to heart, and Lakatos's answer to the problem of demarcation was that real science produces successful research programs. That science is never like a one and done type thing, right? Newton didn't, develop the laws of gravity and then physics stopped. No, Newton came up with the laws of gravity, and then we had this whole host of other questions, right? The same with Einstein, the same with Darwin. Take your pick. And so Lakatos says that what happens after a scientific theory is accepted is that a research program is built around that theory, and
Sorry, I had this
terrible joke. And that successful research programs are developed around that theory, and the signs of a good, healthy science or real science is not that the question is answered, but that more questions are created and that more problems are created for people. So yeah, it's still very much an area of research for philosophers. I mean, philosophers are researching what philosophers said 3,000 years ago, but yeah, Lakatos is still a very important part in the philosophy of science, I would say.
And as a more personal question, but what you mentioned earlier that you used to be a theist?
Yes.
And what brought you away from that perspective?
Sure. We'll get real personal I might need to break out a drink for this. Yeah, so there are a lot of things that brought me away from that. So first would be not the philosophical problem of evil, but the experience of evil.
Right.
Over the course of my life, I've lost a lot of people who were very close to me and who I loved. And this kind of naturally raised a lot of questions like, why did that happen?
Right.
Why did they have to die? Why didn't I die? Why?
Right.
Lots of, and that's actually kind of what got me interested in philosophy. The second, actually, as weird as it sounds, was going to theology school.
I don't think it's weird at all. It's actually quite common. Once
Yeah.
people examine those things on a far deeper level, as long as they're intellectually honest,
Right.
they start. I know many people that went to school for theology, and it was that process that eventually led them to leave the religion.
Mm-hmm. So I come from, I grew up in the American South, and so the type of Christianity that I used to subscribe to was a form of evangelical Christianity, and
So like the worst. Right?
Bible Belt Christianity, right?
Yeah.
There's a couple of assumptions that comes along with evangelical Christianity that and questions and assumptions that I was looking to answer when I got to theology school that were not answered. One of the biggest ones, there's this idea, and different Christian denominations take this more seriously to less seriously to an extent, and I'm not trying to generalize everyone here, but there was this idea in evangelical Christianity of the Bible as the inerrant word of God. And not all Christians hold to this. I want to be very clear about that. But evangelical Christianity specifically has this view of the Bible that, all Christians accept the Bible as scripture. as God breathed, as Paul says in the New Testament. People have different understandings of what that means. What I interpreted that as meaning is that although there were human writers to the text, this text was inspired directly by God, that these people were, however you want to phrase that religiously, filled with the Holy Spirit, that they were channeling God. You have a similar concept in Islam with the Prophet Muhammad. The angel Gabriel reads to Muhammad, and Muhammad writes, right, taken right. So there's this view that the Bible was wholly inspired by God. And once you really start digging into the history of the biblical text, how it was put together, why it was put together, I'm not saying that it directly refutes that idea, but it makes it increasingly problematic.
Right. Right.
What you learn is that the Bible was put together like any other historical book.
Sure. I think in some ways even more problematically.
Mm-hmm.
I am in general fairly skeptical of history as being some objective source of knowledge. This is the one point where I actually tend to agree with the postmodernists, which, and again, I mean, my thesis is is a critique of postmodernism. I think, for the most part, it is intellectually incoherent in what it eventually became, and then some of the conclusions that it eventually holds. But the idea that much of history is just rewritten by the victor, that much of what we understand through history is really the result of power dynamics, and therefore it is inherently biased, I think is quite true. And then, of course, the postmodernism, goes crazy and falls to the side, making completely self-contradictory claims. But it originated from something that was positive, which was, let's not be naive about some of these things that we just take for granted. And so in that sense, I think it had some value in the beginning.
Yeah, and the history teacher in me is wants to respond to that.
Yeah, please respond.
Push back a little bit.
Yes,
against it. I'm not saying you're wrong by any stretch of the imagination. I think that's true to a degree.
Yeah.
So I said before that science isn't the only discipline that assumes a form of naturalism. Most historians don't really have an opinion on this. It's mostly philosophers, but I would take it a step further and say that disciplines like history also presuppose a form of naturalism, or that it should presuppose a form of naturalism. And I'll explain a little bit what I mean by that, but I want to get to your point first. So I would say I would start off by explaining that that history is very narrative driven. So on the one hand, I agree with you in the sense that historical narratives are, the phrase that you brought up that people oftentimes bring up, history is written by the victors, that historical narratives can be and oftentimes are inherently biased towards the person writing the narrative.
Right.
Take your pick of any wartime propaganda, right? And that proves that point. Where I would push back a little bit is I would say that so narratives are interpretations of historical facts. And historical facts, much like, and I use the word fact here very loosely, I think historical facts are just like scientific facts are inherently inductive, which means that they can be wrong. And history, probably more so than science, oftentimes these facts are shown to be wrong. Narratives are interpretations of the facts, but at the end of the day, the narrative still has to correspond to the facts. I'll give you an example, right? So one of the historical narratives that has changed a lot over the past 10 years, there's been monumental changes, has been the narrative of early human history. When humans first appeared, and how humans migrated across the globe. In fact, when I first started teaching World History 1 at a local technical college, one of the questions on my exam, I use this a lot because the exam changed. I taught there for 5 years, and the question changed twice, and I had to change it a third time afterwards. But the question was, human beings first appeared in Africa blank years ago. Right. When I first started teaching history, it was roughly 150,000 years ago. A couple of years after that, we had some archaeological remains from the Rift Valley in Africa. It pushed it back to about 200,000 years ago. About 5 years ago, they discovered human skeletal remains in Morocco, dating back to about 300,000 years. Right. So now we're back to 300,000 years. If they're all the way up in Morocco, and we know that humans originated from sub-Saharan Africa, that means we're probably looking at 350, 400,000 years ago. Right. So we have facts, loosely facts in quotation marks.
You still there?
Am I back?
Yeah, you froze for like a minute, but I think you're back now.
Sorry.
Yeah, I can hear. No, you're good.
So those facts change, and as a result of those facts changing, the historical narrative changes. But I can still appeal to historical evidence to check your narrative.
Of course.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, so and I would say the same thing about science.
Yeah.
I think the difference, though, is that I think science has more concrete tools.
Yeah.
Because some of the, like you said, you can still use the kind of the historical method to show where some of these things are actually false. And I would say that, in some ways you're also using the scientific method to do some of that. But I think it's much easier to be misled by false historical narratives.
Yeah.
And so, the fact, for example, that when I went to school, someone like Christopher Columbus was taught to me as some kind of hero, as opposed to being a murderer and genocidal maniac, is something that I find repulsive. Like, I think it is such a failure of the educational system that the history of indigenous people has been forgotten, and it's pure propaganda.
Right.
And so I don't think my issue is so much with history itself, but more the way in which I think history is misused.
Yes.
So yeah, I think it's a good distinction to make. I think
there's always been a very close relationship between history and propaganda, and people picked up on that very early. So I think I would agree with you in the sense that whoever controls the historical narrative can use that narrative for their ends.
Sure.
You saw this in Nazi Germany, right? Nazi historians literally rewrote human history to fit Nazi propaganda.
We're seeing that now with what's going on in Ukraine.
Yes.
And in Russia.
Right.
So, man, it's been going on pretty fast. It's already an hour and 15 minutes in. I would definitely love to have you back at some point. This is a good conversation. I want to say, do any of you guys in the audience have any questions that you would like us to answer? Usually we go up to like an hour and 20. Sometimes longer if Mike is here as well, but he was dealing with storms and stuff going on over there, and so let me see. If you guys have any questions for us before we start to close up here. But in the meantime, was there anything else that you wanted to address? I know you had mentioned backstage your dissertation that you're working on. I don't know if you wanted to mention anything about the work you're doing there.
Yeah, we might. I mean, I'm more than happy to talk about this now. I might unpack a can of worms, but so I'm really interested in the philosophy of time and examining how that relates to other areas. What's interesting to me, well, there's a lot of stuff interesting about it, but going back to naturalism, and back to your original question of where philosophers might go wrong, uh, where philosophers of science might go wrong, there's a really weird tendency in the philosophy of time. So you have two general ideas: A theory of time and B theory of time. A theory of time, uh, I'm going to throw a lot of definitions, so I apologize in advance. But a theory of time, very loosely speaking, is this idea that the past is in some ontological sense real, um, and that the present moment is in some ontological sense real. B theory of time is the idea that we exist and live in a timeless universe. B theory of time is what is to date, um, matches most closely to what modern physics tells us about the universe. But you still have a whole group of philosophers arguing for a theory of time, which I think is interesting. And most of their arguments hinge upon either mathematical arguments or logical arguments.
But doesn't B theory of time also say that the past, present, and future are real?
Yeah, so depends on who you ask. Yeah. And to return to a point I said earlier, think I don't think these philosophical categories neatly fit onto the scientific claims.
Hmm.
But what the more scientifically inclined B theorist would say is that uh, at a fundamental level, there is no ontological distinction between past, present, and future.
Okay, so I would love to have you back when next time my brother is on, because
Sure.
uh, my interpretation or understanding of that is a little bit different.
Okay.
Um, and I could be just misunderstanding what's being said. But my understanding was that, it's um, what isn't real is this idea that the past is gone and the future is yet to come.
Mm.
Um, what I understand to be real is that time, past, present, and future exist, analogous to chapters in a book.
Yeah.
They're kind of there's a spatial and kind of a temporal point, almost like a point on a map, in a sense, that would be the universe. And that is, yeah, I'm not sure if I'm explaining that
Mm.
correctly, but
No, and it might be I'm slightly misrepresenting the different positions. The position that I'm exploring through my writing is it's a form of B theory of time, which is Bachelard's whole idea is that to treat time, that where we go wrong is when we start to treat and to talk about time as a thing in the
as,
same way
as
that we,
opposed to like more of like a description of things,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
which could lead us into some tricky philosophical territory. So,
And
um,
that's a good point, because I've actually dealt with that when talking to idealists, where you're like,
mm,
well, if you define what is real, as what takes up space and time, well, then what is space and time? But
mhm,
like, I'm not suggesting that space and time are objects.
right,
I'm suggesting they are almost like attributes
mhm.
of what it means for something to exist. If that makes sense.
Yes, yes. Um, time specifically, you know, it gets tricky. What I'm most concerned with is that going back to your first question, how do philosophers sometimes go astray with things to treat to treat time ontologically can lead to some strange philosophical positions,
Right.
as opposed to treating time as a basically a mathematical description.
Right. Right.
That's kind of more so what I'm
That
getting
makes
at.
sense.
Yeah.
Let me go back because I think there were some questions that were asked. 1 second. The one thing that drives me crazy about Max is that there's not like I don't see a scroll bar. Tries to go back up and it like appears for a second and then disappears. Okay, there we go. Whew, that was tough. Let me see. Where is it? You, because the audience has like a couple of questions. I'm trying to get back to it.
Yeah, I see a couple of them if you want me to.
Okay, here's one. What is your moral framework? That was a good one.
Yeah. So most of my time is spent in the history and philosophy of science. I love ethics. I don't really have like super strong positions on ethics.
Hmm.
Um, it's even hard for me to say like on the one hand, my immediate reaction was to say like I'm more partial to something like virtue ethics, but even then, I think these large meta ethical theories personally don't really play a major part in my day to day ethical decisions.
What does?
Yeah. Well, even that, I want to walk back a little bit now. I mean, generally speaking, so let's say if I was having a conversation with my students recently about vegetarianism. We were actually, so I teach a class called the philosophy of anime.
Oh, that's awesome.
And we were talking about an anime called The Promised Neverland. I don't know if you've seen it before.
I've heard of it. I've never seen it, but I've heard of it, I think.
Minor spoilers ahead, just FYI. But the premise of the show is that it's drawing an analogy between and I'm sorry for the spoilers again, but the premise of the show is that these kids live in an orphanage, and the plot twist is that you find out that these kids are being used as food, right?
Wow.
So the analogy that's being drawn here, of course, is that is to factory farming and the way in which our society treats animals. So I say all that to say that I don't say, to answer this question like, is it unethical to eat meat? I wouldn't start off answering that question as a deontologist, or that my answer to that question specifically would be a little bit more utilitarian. But again, ethics is not my I don't have super strong opinions. I love to read rational arguments about applied ethical problems and questions, but I don't have like a moral framework that I operate from.
Yes. Thank you for answering that. As people that the audience, I think at this point, because we've had probably like 4 or 5 episodes about my moral philosophy.
Okay.
Is I'm a more realist.
Hmm.
I take a phenomenological approach to morality, where I think we can reduce what we mean by good and evil by looking at what does it mean for a consciousness to have certain kinds of experiences, and are values arbitrary, or are they kind of built as a result of the nature of these experiences? And I would say that there's like a kind of a universal nature to these experiences.
So can I ask you a question built
Sure.
off of that? So, going back to conversations I've had with theists before that I'm sure you've probably had, what would your response be to like the moral argument for the existence of God, for example, that morality and your inclinations about morality lend itself or derive from God's existence?
It's a completely unnecessary assumption. Like, for me, the only thing I need to do to have a moral framework is to look at the fact that certain kinds of experiences I have are very different than other ones. Like suffering and well-being are real experiences. And all that I mean by right and wrong, those are judgments, or those are descriptions of certain behaviors that will lead my consciousness to have a pleasurable experience or a one of suffering. And so I'm not saying, oh, we find this in nature, therefore it's right. I'm not going about the naturalistic fallacy there. I'm just saying that it's an issue of language. Like good and evil are descriptions of things that of experiences we can ground phenomenologically. And so I don't believe that values arise from thin air, like some moral subjectivists tend to think it's whatever the individual thinks is right. I think that it's something far deeper than that. I think it's actually, we're looking at the nature of consciousness itself. And then when we're talking about right and wrong, we're really talking about like kind of a spectrum of experience. And it's a spectrum that we can be mistaken about. Like people can think that certain behaviors will lead them to a state of well-being, and actually turn out to be wrong about it, simply out of ignorance. An example is, smoking before people knew that smoking was unhealthy.
Right.
It's like, it's possible to I think value the wrong thing there. And if you don't value your health or you don't value well-being, that's fine. But then it's almost like saying you can't claim to be healthy if you don't value health. The same way that I don't think you can claim to be moral just because you've decided not to value well-being or suffering. Like you're just outside of the field of where these concepts are actually relating to. I hope that kind of clears it up a little bit.
Yeah, no, it does.
So in some sense, I am a consequentialist, although I think there are some limitations to that perspective. I think intentions also matter. So I'm not a pure, one way or another. I think I take a little bit of a different approach to morality. Another question for you: is there anyone who you think has a great handle on the demarcation problem these days?
Yeah, that's unfortunately, I think the problem of demarcation will probably be a problem so long as there's people to read about the problem. Nowadays, the most popular answer to the demarcation problem is, as silly as it might sound, is kind of this vague combination of Kuhn and Popper. In fact, if you're I remember you could pick up a college textbook. I took a while back. I was talking with a biology professor that I worked with about demarcation, and he said that what he starts off his class, he actually started off his class talking about that. And at the beginning of most biology, chemistry textbooks, usually there's some mention of falsification, especially if it's a laboratory-based science, because it's easy to falsify things in laboratory-based sciences. But yeah, most philosophers, well, most loosely, I don't have like any data to back this up, but a lot of philosophers would probably take a combination of the two. If I had to give an answer, I would probably take a combination of the two.
Right.
It does look like, I don't think I wouldn't say that it's 100% Popper, right? There are some issues with falsification. There are some current fields of science that, if we take a strict falsification definition, might not be considered science. So I want to avoid that. Some aspects of theoretical physics might not be able to be empirically falsified. Right. But I don't think that doesn't make it a science. Right.
Well, I also think it's inaccurate to, even in valuing verification, we're not claiming that every single aspect of a theory needs to be verified in exactly the same way. We're talking about, again, a spectrum of likelihood. There may be certain things that we can't verify, but we can verify its, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm blanking on the term I want to use. Kind of the consequences of of certain phenomena.
Right.
We can kind of build a picture that way, kind of moving backwards in a sense. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think that this is actually a way that philosophy can maybe instruct science in some ways. We have a replication problem in a lot of psychology journals now, where a lot of the experiments that were performed are not able to be replicated, and people who take a pessimistic view would say something along the lines of, over the past couple of decades, upwards of 50% of the experiments that were published can't be replicated, which is a issue. But I would say that one of the ways that we can talk about demarcation, and one of the things that I would encourage people going into science to do, would be to not be afraid to publish negative results. That
Sure.
this is a way that science proceeds.
Forward. Right, absolutely.
It's not sexy, right? No one wants to publish an inconclusive study, right? But that historically, that this has been the case, and this is what helps us to distinguish what avenues of scientific research are worth investigating.
Right. I want to address this question real quick, because I think that is a little bit misleading, in the sense that, yeah, I mean, obviously all experience is in some sense subjective, because we're all different people, beings, organisms. But moral subjectivity is a very specific term referring to the idea that what is moral is what the subject believes is moral. And that is what I deny. I think, our intuitions and what constructs our, the nature of well-being and suffering, potentially could have been different, although I'm not sure how we would go about determining what is contingent as opposed to necessary. The issue with bringing up evolution, which I do think is valuable to a point, because I think we can recognize other animals sharing some of these things, and there is an evolutionary component, and certainly there is a survival component to why morality ends up being what it is. But I don't think it's purely evolution, in the sense that I think phenomenology is, in some sense, deeper than that. The fact that a lot of these organisms have evolved in very different ways, and yet there's kind of this universal shared aspect of what it means to have an experience, what it means to suffer, what it means to flourish, I think is kind of a fundamental component to what it means to be a conscious organism of any kind. And so for me, I think that is where a foundation for morality can be found, is in this universal thing. The last couple of questions for you is, what is your take on free will?
Sorry to disappoint, but much like ethics, I don't have a strong background in the philosophy of mind, so I'm very hesitant to enter into the free will determinism debate. If you put me in a corner and force me to pick, I would very tentatively say that I probably support some form of compatibilism. Yeah, that would be that would very loosely be my position. But again, this is not my forte, not my area, and I don't really have super strong opinions about it. I will say I could maybe talk a little bit about my approach to consciousness.
Sure.
Yeah. Related to that, and this would be a predictive area of naturalism, the type of naturalism that I support, which I would ultimately, I would say that I think consciousness, if I had to pick, I would say it's going to eventually result to some sort of physical process. If it doesn't, my form of naturalism has some problems. Because up until this point, historically, naturalistic explanations have kind of defaulted to this idea that physical objects produce physical causes. And so if all of a sudden we come across a physical cause in our consciousness that isn't caused by a physical object, that if in some way consciousness is not reducible to purely brain functions, that would present some sort of like for me anyway, would present some sort of ontological gap in nature.
For sure.
And
That makes sense.
if that is the case, maybe I'll come back on the show and recant everything that I just said. But
Right.
I don't think that's going to happen. I don't know. What are your thoughts on free will, determinism, philosophy of mind?
Real quick, I just want to
Yeah.
reply to this. How is phenomenology not subjective? What I would say is that phenomenology is the attempt to talk about subjectivity, and to see whether or not subjective experience can be discussed in objective terms, if that makes sense. Like, is there yes, we can say that all of us are having a subjective experience right now, but is there a way to talk about the subjective experience in a way that is in some sense shared, in a way that we can understand on a kind of collective level?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that it is dealing with subjective experience, but it's dealing with it in a way that I think is quite interesting. So I'll have to do like a whole show just on phenomenology at some point, because I think that right now is like my primary interest is phenomenology. Like, I don't know if you've read Husserl and if you've read Ponty. I think they're brilliant.
Yeah, very, very. It's been a while, yeah, but I have. It's been a minute.
Last question. Are you a human or a non-human with respect to the laws of nature?
I'm not super familiar with what Hume said about the laws of nature. If you want to elaborate on that, maybe help me out to where I would fall on this.
I'm trying to remember, because it's been a while since I've read Hume. If anybody, correct me if I'm wrong in the audience if I'm getting this mixed up, but I mean, wasn't his whole approach like kind of looking at induction as a problem? Like, I mean, he really literally said that the problem of induction, right? Like, it seems like he thought that we can't really talk about them in terms of laws, more like in terms of almost like habits of observation.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing about what we observe in science that can tell us that it's going to operate the same way tomorrow.
Right.
I could be getting confused there. I think that's what. So, well, real quick. Well, a few things here. Yes, I'll definitely do a show sometime soon. I think it'll be super fun. Briley says, cease to know, but it isn't mind independent and therefore cannot be objective. So I think that there is an issue there in definition, because I think minds exist in nature.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I'm not talking about mind dependent in a sense of like an opinion. I'm talking, what I mean by mind dependent but still objective is I'm talking about the nature of the mind itself. Certain preferences or opinions or beliefs are mind dependent, but don't actually correspond or might not correspond to what is actually the case out there. But when I'm talking about morality, I'm talking about the nature of the mind itself, like how our experiences are framed, not necessarily particular individual beliefs about something. It sounds a little bit strange, but I think there is a very important distinction there. I think the term objective is a very confused
It is.
term.
Mm-hmm.
So another thing I want to address, that I use the term non-subjective and objective interchangeably. What I'm trying to say is that what we mean when we talk about objective, at least in the context of morality and phenomenology, maybe not in all contexts, but in that context, is more the collective nature of subjectivity.
Yeah.
So I need to also. I'm curious to know why the reaction. Now, I mean, don't get me wrong. I think there are severe problems with Husserl, and really, I can't think of any philosopher that I read where ultimately I don't come to at least certain points where it's like, this is so incorrect. For me, I think I'm especially interested in Merleau-Ponty's work, because I think that the idea of studying people with brain damage to see the way in which their perception of the world changes as a way to illuminate something kind of universal about everybody else, I think is quite interesting.
It is.
Now, I think he has some problematic ideas about science that I think are a little bit misguided. But that's for another discussion. But yeah, I'm curious to know why that reaction. I'm just looking at the rest of the comments here. But yeah, I just want to thank you again for joining me tonight, and I would definitely love to do this again at some point. I'm really hoping that this episode saves, because when I went to broadcast, like I said, this thing came up saying that it was like out of storage, but I think I just paid for an updated version of StreamYard, and so I'm hoping that it all goes through and that nothing gets lost here. Either way, I definitely appreciate the conversation, and I really hope that it does get saved for everybody to see. But if not, well, I'll definitely bring you back for more conversations in the future if you're interested.
Absolutely, anytime. And I really appreciate you having me on to begin with. Yeah,
for sure. I don't know if what was his name, but yeah, I'm just looking at the rest here. Yeah, I don't know if Alex is still in the room, but I was curious to know that reaction. Maybe you can leave it in a comment to let us know your thoughts on Husserl. But in general, I find phenomenology and philosophy of mind to be probably my main interest right now.
Okay. Would love to pick your mind about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll definitely bring you back. And all right, well, as always, thank you everybody that joined us tonight. If you want to support us, Axioms, patreon.com/Axioms on Trial. Thank you so much for Zachariah for that donation. I very much appreciate it. Also, as always, like and subscribe to the channel if you come across it and haven't yet. If you guys have any questions or you would like to come on, feel free to email me at axiomsontrial@gmail.com. And let me see. Okay. And yeah, hopefully this will stay on the channel. I'm still learning all the technical stuff behind it. Like, I don't know if there's a difference between what StreamYard saves and what YouTube saves, but hopefully there won't be any kind of issues there.
Yeah.
Either way, like I said, I'll bring you back on in case there's any issues. But hopefully this will
for sure
stay on, because I think it was a really important conversation.
No, I really appreciate this conversation. Thanks everybody for the questions. Like I said, anytime, I'm game. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. And I'll see you guys again soon. So I hope you guys have a good night. And until next time.
Appreciate it.